To show the position of a place on a map, I will add two new components. One is a modal. A modal is an overlay, which you see on many websites. It's basically like a pop-up, but built into the page, not in a new browser window. It has a background where we can use this backdrop, which we already use for the side drawer on mobile. And then we have that modal as an overlay. In that modal, we can display anything. And indeed, I will build a reusable modal here, which we can use to host any kind of content, confirmation dialogues, whatever we need. In this case, a map. And that's then the second thing we need. We'll build a special version of that modal, which uses that modal, but then hosts a map inside of it. So let's start with the generic modal itself. For this, in UI elements here, next to card and so on, we can create a new file, the modal.js file, and also a modal CSS file because we will certainly need some styling. In modal.js, as always, we import React from React, and then we have our modal component here, which receives props and which exports this modal then in the end. We also need to import our CSS file here, so import /modal CSS. Now actually in here, I want to have a second component. No one is forcing you to only have one component per file. Typically that is what you have, but if you have two components that work closely together, then you can also absolutely have more than one component in a file. Please note that I will only export the modal here though. The second component, which I will build here, is only for internal use, so the modal component will use that second component I will also build. And that will be the actual modal overlay, so the thing we will actually see on the screen. This is another component I add here, which is not exported but will be used by modal. Now let's start with structuring the content of the modal overlay. I will use the React DOM create portal method there. So let's import React DOM from React DOM. And then here I will return React DOM create portal and output some content here in a special place. There I will use document get element by ID modal-hook, which is a place we should add in the public index.html file. Maybe here between backdrop hook and drawer hook. That's our modal hook. That's the place where the modal will then be mounted to in the real DOM. So in the modal component, we now need to specify the content, which should actually be rendered there. Now the content here is a div with a class name of modal. Now actually, it's more than that. I want to be flexible here, so I will render a template literal here so that I can add my modal class, but I can also inject some other class name, and that's props.className. So that in the end, when we use the modal, we could also add our own classes to the modal, and we're not restricted to the classes set up here. Just a little extra flexibility. I will also add a style prop and set this to props.style, so that we could also directly add inline styles to this modal if we wanted to. Then I want to have a header in there. So basically a header, a title shown at the top of the modal. This header will also receive a class name. And here again, I want to be really flexible. So we'll add modal__header, but then also add props.header class so that we can add our own header classes if we want to. In the header, the idea is to have a h2 tag where we output some text that is received on a props header property. Now that's the header. Below the header, but still inside the div, I will add a form. We'll not always need that, but if we had some modal content that should be part of a form, wrapping everything with a form here can be an advantage. Now you could also certainly build this in other ways, but here I want to have a really flexible modal, so I want to give the developer who will then use the modal, which of course is us, the possibility to add content that is automatically wrapped in a form. Not a must do, but something I want to do here. Here I will add an onSubmit handler and check if props onSubmit is set. And if it is set, I will call props onSubmit. So we'll bind onSubmit to the onSubmit I get through props. And otherwise, I will pass an inline function here where we get the event and where I call event prevent default. Why? Because I want to make sure that if we render any buttons inside of that form, we don't accidentally reload the page by triggering our form submission here. If we do provide our own submit function, then it's the duty of that submit function to prevent the default. Now inside of that form, I'll add another div. Class name here, again, is a dynamic binding to be really flexible. And there I will bind this to modal __ content, and then props.content class. So similar to the header, the idea simply is that if we use the modal in some place of our app, we can dynamically provide our custom header class to adjust the default look, our custom extra class for the content, and I'll do the same then later for the footer of the modal, which we'll also add. Inside of this content, I'll output props children, so whatever we add between the opening and closing tag of the modal. And then last but not least, I'll add a footer, still inside of the form, and here in that footer, or on that footer, just as before, dynamic classes are added. And here I will have modal __ footer as a class, but then for extra flexibility, add props.footer class to allow external customization. Now that's, by the way, also the reason now why I have that form here. In that footer, the user should be able to inject footer content, for example, buttons that allow the user to confirm a choice or something like that. And that would be hard to do if we only injected everything in the content here. Now, by the way, that split into a content div and the footer is the reason for this default form here. If the user wants to render a modal that holds a form, of course you could inject the form here as a content with props children. But if you want to have a nice styling where the submit buttons are visually separated from the content, which is the styling that will be applied by default with the default classes I add here, then this would not be possible to be all in one form, because the form would live here and the buttons would live here and they would not be inside of the form. That's why I have this wrapping general form here, which wraps both the content div as well as the footer, where the user can then inject, for example, the inputs of a form and then the submit buttons. And if you're not using a form and you're not providing on submit, it's ignored anyways. So that's the general structure of the modal overlay. Now, why do I have a separate component down there? Because a modal is more than just the overlay. A modal also needs a backdrop, and I also want to play a little animation when we open and close the modal. So therefore, we need to import two more things. We need to import the backdrop from /backdrop here, and import CSS transition from React transition group, that animation library we already used earlier. With that, in our modal component, not in modal overlay, but in modal, I want to return a React fragment because I'll have some sibling top-level elements. And I want to check if we have a show prop, which is true-ish, in which case I will render the backdrop. And on the backdrop, we can click. And I want to trigger a onCancel method or function, which I receive on the onCancel prop here, if that is the case. So that outside of the modal, in the component where we use it, we can handle the cancellation and close it or do whatever we want to do. Now, besides rendering the backdrop, I also want to render the CSS transition here. And the in prop here is bound to props.show, which is our trigger for the backdrop as well. I set mount on enter and unmount on exit, add a timeout of 200 milliseconds, and then class names, not class name, but class names, and set this to modal. Now, the appropriate class names which this CSS transition component then will use will be added in modal CSS. And speaking of that, attached you find a modal CSS file, and you can simply put the content you find in there into your modal CSS file. Now, make sure you're importing modal CSS, and you're almost done. I'm saying almost because the key part is missing. The modal overlay, we're not using that in our modal down there. Of course, that is what I want to render between my CSS transition components though. So here we can add modal overlay and close it. And now do one thing. We forward all the props we get from outside to modal overlay. This syntax might look strange, but what it does is it takes the props we pass to modal, which is the component we export, and forwards them to modal overlay, which is the internal component which we don't export. This allows us to set, for example, footer class, content class, header, and so on the exported modal component, where we of course don't need it, we don't use it here, but we then forward it to modal overlay. So it allows us to set props on this internal component from outside, so to say. And this syntax might look strange, but this is the spread operator, which takes all the key value pairs of the props object and spreads them as attributes, so to say, onto modal overlay. And with that, we created a general modal. Now that general modal is nice, but of course we want a modal with a map. Now we'll work on the map soon, but for now let's show the normal modal. For that we can go to the place item where we have this view on map button. And now we need to manage some state, which we change when that button is pressed to show the modal, and then also when the backdrop of the modal is pressed to hide the modal. So I will import, use state from React here, and add a new state in place item, show map and set show map, which initially is false, because initially I don't want to show the modal. And then I will add functions here, the open map handler. There I simply call set show map and set this to true. And the close map handler, and you can guess what I'll do there, I'll set this to false. Now we also need to import the modal we just built. So import modal from our shared components, UI elements, the modal file there. And now use that. Now how do we use it? I want to render it next to my list item, and keep in mind it won't really be rendered there. Instead, because I use a portal, both on the backdrop as well as the modal overlay, it will be injected in a different place of our index.html file. And that's the nice thing about portals, which I already touched on earlier. They allow us to use a component in a certain place, in this case in the place item, and yet render the content of that component in a different place, which semantically might be better than attaching the modal markup next to the list item. We might be able to achieve the same look, but for screen readers and so on, and for semantics in general, that would not be ideal. So that's where a portal can help us. Now to have multiple sibling root items, we need React fragment. So we can wrap the list item with that. And then with React fragment as a new top level element in this component, we can render our modal here next to the list item. Now on this modal, I want to set the show prop and set this equal to show map, so to this state we just added. I also have an onCancel handler here, which, just to make this clear again, is in the end a function that will be triggered when we click the backdrop. That's when I, in the end, forward that click event to onCancel and trigger the function that's passed through onCancel. So onCancel will therefore point at the close map handler function, so that this function is executed when we click the backdrop. I will provide text for the header, and there I simply want to use the address, the human readable address of the place. And add an extra content class, which should be place-item __ modal-content. Let me reformat that to make it easier to read. And also add a footer class to that modal, which I'll set to place-item __ modal-actions. Now last but not least, I'll set the footer prop itself to a dynamic value, which will be some JSX, because there I want to have a button, which allows me to close the modal. And therefore I'll add the onClick listener to the button and set this equal to the close map handler, just as onCancel. This button component here, through the footer prop, will be rendered in our modal overlay in this place at the end. That's where I use the footer prop. And since I forward all props I pass to modal overlay, if I pass anything in a footer prop, this is where it will end up. So with that, I prepared the modal, but the main content is missing. Between the opening and closing tag of the modal, we have to specify what should be rendered in the place of props children. Because remember, props children is that special prop React knows, which renders whatever is between the opening and closing tag of your React, of your JSX element. So here in the modal, there I want to render my map. For now, I will render a div here with a class name of map container. And I will actually add this class in place item CSS, maybe here above the media query, Map container can be a simple class where you set a height of, let's say, 20 rem and a width of 100%. So make sure to add this class to place item CSS and to this div here. And inside of this div, we'll soon add the map. For now, I'll just have a h2 tag where I say the map, which is of course not our final result. And with that, we're almost there. The missing piece now is that we connect the buttons down there. Now we can add an onClick listener, as I already did it here in the footer, because the custom button component in the end forwards the default onClick event to, well, the function that is received on an onClick prop. So we have to provide such an onClick prop to react to a click. And hence here on the view on map button, I'll add onClick and bind this to open map handler. So to that function which sets show map to true. Now if we save all files, it should recompile. And if I now click on view on map, you see that modal slide in and of course also slide out if I close it. However, it reloads the page if I close. So let's quickly go to the modal. Reason for that is that we have this form which gets submitted. And yeah, there on prevent default, of course I should execute this as a function, not just point at it. So I add the parentheses after prevent default. And now with that, if we go back, I can click close and it doesn't reload. Instead, it just removes the modal. And this also should look good on mobile. Yeah. Bit big there maybe. So maybe we should shrink our map container a little bit. Let's say 15 rem should do the trick. And with that, it looks good. But of course now the map itself is missing. We could of course also, by the way, fine tune the position where the modal is shown, that it's shown further on top. That could be done in the modal CSS file. There, change top 30 VH maybe to 22 VH. VH is a CSS unit that is basically the viewport height. And this means 22% from the top of your viewport height. So now if you do that, yeah, I think that looks pretty decent. Yeah. So now let's focus on outputting a nice little map rendered through Google Maps here in this modal.